We all know that after a few disappointing seasons, 2022 wasn't the year for Daniel Ricciardo. And while he's planning an epic comeback, Mika Hakkinen isn't too positive about it. In fact, he's not sure if Ricciardo will be able to revive his F1 career. Instead, he sees the Australian facing an uphill battle to get back on the F1 grid. Sure, Ricciardo's a fan favorite, but let's not forget how he lost his McLaren seat a year earlier than expected after two very disappointing seasons with them. And if that wasn't enough, Lando Norris managed to outperform the Australian every single time.
Has finally switched on those soft compound tyres, and there goes Lando Norris past his teammate Daniel Ricciardo and up into 7th.
Sure, he definitely scored McLaren's first win in 9 years at Monza in 2021.
Daniel Ricciardo has returned to the top step of the podium in a dramatic race here this afternoon in the sunshine of Monza.
But he simply couldn't get a hold of the MCL 35 or even the MCL 36 in his last two campaigns with the working outfit. Along with that, he struggled to regain a competitive spot on the F1 grid in 2022, and right before taking up his reserve driver role at Red Bull at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix.
I'm really excited to be back and just to be around a lot of faces that I have a lot of good memories with. I still keep in touch with quite a few of the crew here, which is not.
Hakkinen made a not so surprising prediction. It seems like the 33-year-old might not be able to mount the comeback he's been talking about.
I ruled out in my head that I would return to the Red Bull family, but yeah, like 4 years ago, I certainly thought it was a long shot.
And that's when the former two-time world champion shared a piece of his own life. A sabbatical might ruin every chance of a comeback. Now, Hakkinen already decided to leave Formula One back in 2001. At the time, he was a two-time world champion. In fact, he had the chance to take a sabbatical year. Here's the thing, once you're off the grid, how do you prove to them that you're good enough? Or even better, how do you prove you're a faster driver than ever? After all, it's Formula One. A bunch of rookies come by now and then. So how do you prove to the teams that you're still better than them? I agree, that's not as positive as we'd want him to be, but isn't that the reality? On the other hand, I gotta admit, Ricciardo's stuck in a pretty challenging situation right now.
You know, it's not certainly not the news I want to share or the outcome I wanted.
At the same time, his personality works like a charm because everyone on the paddock seems to love him. And let's not forget his top-notch sense of humor. In fact, that's also why we love him. But in the end, teams like McLaren, they want a winner and nothing short of that. But here's my question. Isn't Danny Rick already a winner? 8 times to be exact. Not only that, but he's also piled up 32 podium finishes, even if they were mostly from his Red Bull days. Surely that's gotta count for something when the teams are weighing up their options for 2024, right? At the same time, let's not forget about Mika's point about the comparison. After all, the one with Lando Norris didn't really work out. Sure, there's always some imbalance between two teammates, but with that level of imbalance, let's just say it's not so great for the development of the car. Having said that, that's probably why McLaren CEO Zach Brown reached that conclusion. In fact, we're not surprised, and neither was the Honey Badger, who definitely saw that coming. After all, they literally spent millions of dollars to buy him out of his last year, only to engage in another legal battle to sign Oscar Piastri. But don't worry, because all isn't lost for Ricciardo. There are a couple of successful comeback stories in Formula One. First, Kimi Räikkönen left the sport in 2009, only to come back 2 years later. On top of that, his second stint in Formula One ended up being longer than his first. And let's not forget Fernando Alonso, who's still churning out amazing performances. Even though the 41-year-old took 2 years out right after quitting McLaren back in 2018, it hasn't stopped him. On the other hand, Hakkinen said it was a lot easier for them, mostly because they were world champions at the time, and they chose to go away. As for Ricciardo, the Australian doesn't really have a choice. And that brings us to the great mystery of his decline. Let's just say that this year, he's not really an F1 driver anymore, and the people people he left behind still can't really put together the right words to explain what happened. He wrapped his last season in 11th position in the F1 standings for McLaren, and let's just say it was significantly behind his teammate Lando Norris. Clearly, nothing went right for the Australian last year. As for Zak Brown, he simply couldn't explain why Ricciardo's 2-year stint with the team was so underwhelming in the first place. They've definitely tried to figure it out. After all, the Honey Badger gave it everything he got, and the team's relationship with him was pretty good too. So what went wrong? For Brown, it might be a mystery, but for others, it seems like it's time for Ricciardo to accept and wrap up his career now. Sure, none of us expected him to end up like this right after he left Red Bull, but maybe, just maybe, a change of environment might bring his magic back, or at least that's what Brown thinks. Back in Monza, we all saw what he was capable of, and he's done that 7 other times. But do you really think he'd be able to do that once again? Because it doesn't seem like it. With that said, his last decision could change his F1 career forever. Ricciardo decided to become the 3rd driver for Red Bull after rejecting a couple of options, which honestly, I didn't find any great either. He's sticking to his former team, even if that's with a reserve driver role. Sure, Haas and Williams offered race seats for the Australian, but for him, taking a year off was still better than going at the back of the grid. In fact, he was on the verge of taking a sabbatical right when Mercedes and Red Bull stepped forward with reserve driver roles. And rumor has it, Mercedes probably wanted him to replace Lewis Hamilton since his contract was gonna end before 2024 too. But the second this made headlines, the 7-time champion confirmed that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. If anything, Mercedes team boss and Hamilton have their eyes set on a record-breaking 8th championship. At least, that's what the discussions over the multi-year contracts imply. Having said that, Ricciardo finally decided to go with Red Bull. But let's not forget that things aren't quite the same anymore. Ricciardo left as a 7-time race winner and returned as the 3rd driver. And that's a pretty big downgrade, especially if you consider that he left because of Verstappen in the first place. After the young Dutchman started stealing the spotlight, the Honey Badger decided it was finally time to move on to some other team that needs some fresh talent and experience. And now that he's back, Verstappen is a 2-time world champion. If anything, it's not just Red Bull. The entire Formula 1 has its eyes set on the rising star right now. So, is he regretting leaving Red Bull in the first place? Well, he definitely wouldn't put it like that, but I know I would. If anything, I think he does too. But who in their right mind would admit to something like that publicly, especially when they're at the turning point of their career? But not in a good way. If anything, this could probably go in the other direction for him. But here's the question I've got for you. Do you agree with Mika Hakkinen when he says that Ricciardo probably won't be able to make his comeback to Formula 1?